He said they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. Son-in-law may be the prime suspect at this point. And I'm very mindful. I covered the Elizabeth Smart case. I was out in Salt Lake City for 5 weeks while Elizabeth Smart had vanished. And I recall specifically a lot of language saying Ed Smart is likely the prime suspect here. And so you got to be really mindful that, as you know, Megan, you're a lawyer. Police investigations start in the middle of the circle and they go out in concentric circles in terms of investigating family members, right? You start in the middle of the family, you investigate out from there. Then you go to contractors and friends and workers and everybody else who's had some contact. And then there's the randoms. So it is not surprising that someone in the family is being looked at. That language to me was pretty strident, though.
It's surprising to me because there was forced entry. And from the beginning, I thought, well, they must have ruled out the family pretty quickly if this is a case of forced entry, because the family wouldn't need to do that. The family would presumably have a key, and if they didn't have a key and they wanted to get in, they just knock on the door and Nancy Guthrie would open it.
So this is super interesting. And I had a long conversation with my former colleague, Brian Enton, about this, because Brian identified blood drops at the front door, right? And he's shown the video of it. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
However, my source says the back door is wide open. Back door left wide open. That's what my source said. I had Megan, half-hour conversation 2 days ago.
I watched it.
The sheriff, yeah. And I specifically said, so are you telling me, when you said that she did not walk out of that house on her own, I said, are you telling me that she might have been carried out of that house? And I used the word over the threshold of the front door. And he said, I didn't say front door. But he didn't say no carried. But when he said I didn't say no to the front door, and then, and the next day I'm getting information about the back door, it's pretty safe to say, well, that makes perfect sense. However, why is there blood at the front door? And Brian Enton said he couldn't find the trail continuing past to the walkway that would take you to the driveway. Now it is gravel, a little harder maybe to see any blood, but not impossible. So I'm trying to go.
But couldn't they have gotten her in the car, Ashleigh? I mean, like, I'm picturing a scenario where couldn't all those facts be consistent with they came in through the back door, then they got her, then they brought her out the front door after injuring her.
Could.
Then the blood trail continued just to the driveway.
Well, it didn't.
Where they then put her in a car.
That's the problem.
It ended well prior to the driveway?
Yeah, the blood trail is just at the front door on those tiles. Then the gravel starts right away, and it's a walkway to the driveway, and it's not close. I mean, it's a bit of a ways. Nancy Guthrie can't walk 50 yards, pardon me. Nancy Guthrie can't walk 50 yards on her own, so she would need assistance. And if you're bleeding and you've been in some sort of a melee, that would be even less. So I was going through the scenarios in my mind. Okay, maybe the front door camera is smashed, and the doorbell is rung to get Mrs. Guthrie downstairs, because that would be difficult in the middle of the night. It would get her down those stairs. So the confrontation might happen at the front door, right there at the tiles. There's a struggle. And then because the car is not parked right out front where all that could be visible potentially, maybe the car is around the back, and that's why they go out the back door. And because
is that a
you're
possibility?
Now struggling, I have no idea.
Could a car be parked in the back?
I don't know, because I've been trying to see with drone video whether the car could get out into a darker spot or maybe out of camera view, because the smashing has to happen. But I was told that the cameras were smashed, and plural. So if there's a camera in the back, camera in the front, smashed. And then, of course, Brian Enton noticed it and said, asked the sheriff, did you take them? Or do you think the guy or the suspect took them? And the sheriff had a funny answer. He said, yes, I noticed that too. We're looking into it.
Yes. So what Brian Enton saw was like the remnants of a Nest camera, not even the Nest camera, right? Like, it was clear to him that they had been removed, which is not the same thing as destroyed. The sheriff is saying that they were destroyed right before we got to them. So he made it sound like they were destroyed by the perpetrator here, by the bad guy.
Sheriff didn't say on the news conference that the cameras were destroyed. Brian Enton shot that video and asked, the cameras are missing. Did law enforcement take them, or did the perpetrator take them? And the response from the sheriff was, yes, we noticed that too. We're looking into it. And so, look, I can tell you, you know this, Pima County, there's not a lot of crime there. I'm trying to think of the last major thing that happened. I think it was Gabby Giffords being shot there, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? And so I think he's working in real time, and trying to protect his investigation, keep the integrity, and answer real questions he wasn't expecting, maybe, and couching, his verbiage as best he can. But he didn't say, "Oh, we don't know that we took the cameras," or "No, there never was a camera there." He said, "Yes, we noticed that too, and we're investigating that. We've got them."
It's your
Right.
reporting that has added that they were destroyed.
But and multiple. I don't know the location of the other one. My guessing, and it's just me, would be backdoor.
Yeah,
But
that's where you
my
put the Nest
source,
camera.
my source also said, and this is musings, not evidence or information. Who takes an 84-year-old woman who can't walk well on her own? It is a burden. It is a troublesome endeavor. It makes you more susceptible to being caught. You now have a problem on your hands. What are you going to do with this person without anybody seeing it? And it stands to reason. It's very unusual for some random burglar to take the person if something
It's
happens.
not a random burglar. No, I agree. So it's either somebody who's kidnapping her and wants money for a ransom, or is kidnapping her as a revenge because they dislike.
The deeper this case goes, the more one theme keeps coming back. Pressure, not just emotional pressure, financial pressure, timeline pressure, forensic pressure, and pressure inside a family story that still has too many unanswered questions. Because when investigators look at a possible financial motive, they are not only asking whether someone wanted money, they are asking whether money created urgency, whether urgency created conflict, whether conflict created opportunity, and whether opportunity lined up with the exact night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That is why the alleged loan refusal matters so much. According to the source material, one of the most discussed claims is that Annie Guthrie allegedly asked her mother for a significant loan shortly before Nancy vanished, and Nancy reportedly refused. That claim has not been officially confirmed by investigators, so it must remain an allegation. But if it is true, it could become one of the most important emotional and financial moments in the entire timeline. Because in family cases, the word no can carry more weight than people realize. It can change the room. It can change relationships. It can turn private frustration into resentment. It can make someone feel rejected, cornered, embarrassed, or desperate. And in a case involving an elderly woman, a valuable home, possible inheritance, and alleged financial strain, investigators would have to ask whether that refusal was only a family disagreement or whether it became something much darker. But motive alone is never enough. A money problem does not prove a crime. A loan request does not prove a crime. A refusal does not prove a crime. Even family tension does not prove a crime. What matters is whether the financial issue connects to evidence. That is where the case becomes more serious, because investigators would not look at the alleged loan refusal by itself. They would place it beside everything else: Nancy's final dinner at Annie and Tommaso's home, the reported private ride home, the lack of an independent Uber record for the return trip, the long overnight gap, the doorbell camera reportedly stopping at 1:47 a.m., the pacemaker reportedly disconnecting from Nancy's phone at 2:28 a.m., blood reportedly found on the porch, no documented forced entry, the sealed 911 call, a vehicle reportedly held for extensive forensic testing, and now reports suggesting possible human remains may have been found, though not officially identified as Nancy. That is not a simple collection of details. That is a structure. And if investigators are studying a possible financial motive, they would be trying to determine whether that structure points toward planning, opportunity, concealment, or misdirection. The sealed 911 call may eventually become one of the most important pieces of this case, because first calls tell investigators a lot. They show who raised the alarm, when the alarm was raised, what the caller said first, what details were volunteered, what details were missing, whether the caller sounded confused, frightened, calm, rehearsed, or strangely specific. But it is also important to be careful. People react differently under stress. Some people panic. Some sound cold because shock has frozen them. Some talk too much. Some barely speak. So the sound of a person's voice alone is not proof. But the content of the call can matter. If someone reveals knowledge they should not have had yet, investigators notice. If the timeline in the call does not match later evidence, investigators notice. If the first emergency report seems to shape the story in a particular direction, investigators notice. And if the 911 call remains sealed, that may mean authorities are protecting details that still matter to the investigation. That silence can feel frustrating to the public. But in a case like this, silence may be strategy. Investigators may be holding back facts only the real person responsible would know. They may be protecting witness information. They may be waiting for lab results. They may be comparing the call against forensic findings. They may be building a case slowly because they know every word, every timestamp, and every physical detail could be challenged later in court. That is the difference between public suspicion and prosecution. Public suspicion can move fast. Prosecution has to survive. It has to survive defense attorneys. It has to survive expert witnesses. It has to survive cross-examination. It has to survive questions about contamination, timing, motive, access, and alternative explanations. That is why the financial angle, if it is real, must be built carefully. Investigators would need records, bank statements, loan messages, texts, emails, phone logs, property records, insurance documents, estate papers, power of attorney documents, debt records, mortgage history, credit activity, search history, and any communication showing pressure before Nancy disappeared. Because a prosecutor cannot simply stand in court and say, someone wanted money. They have to show why money mattered. They have to show how badly it mattered. They have to show timing. They have to show opportunity. They have to show benefit. And then they have to connect it to the physical facts of the case. That is where the reported power of attorney detail becomes important. According to the source material, in May 2025, a durable power of attorney was reportedly signed naming Annie as the agent over Tommaso's financial and property matters. On its own, that does not prove anything improper. Many couples and family members create legal authority for ordinary reasons. But if investigators are examining financial pressure, documents like that can help them understand who had control, who had responsibility, and who may have known the true financial condition of the household. Legal paperwork can tell investigators a lot. Who could sign? Who could act? Who could move property? Who had financial authority? Who knew about debts? Who knew about assets? Who may have been under pressure? And who may have seen Nancy's money or property as a possible solution? Again, none of that equals guilt, but it gives investigators a map. And once investigators have a map, they start comparing it to the timeline. The timeline is where this case becomes chilling. January 31st, the family dinner, the ride home, the reported last confirmed sighting, then the overnight hours, the doorbell camera issue, the pacemaker disconnect, the blood, the silence, the 911 call the next day. Those hours are the heart of the case. If Nancy was alive and safe after being dropped off, what happened later? If someone came to her home in the middle of the night, how did they know when to come? How did they know she lived alone? How did they know her security weaknesses? How did they know whether she could hear them? How did they know whether cameras were recording? How did they get close without a clear forced entry? And if the story of an outside abduction was staged, who would have had enough knowledge to stage it convincingly? That is the question investigators would have to ask. Because staging is not random. Staging has a purpose. It is meant to move attention away from the truth. A masked figure can make a case look like a stranger attack. A ransom-style story can point suspicion toward unknown criminals. A broken camera can create confusion. A long silence can buy time. A vehicle can move evidence. A sealed call can preserve the first official version of the story. And possible remains, if confirmed, could reveal whether the original narrative was real or constructed. That is why unconfirmed reports of remains matter so much. If remains have truly been found, the investigation would move into a new scientific phase: DNA comparison, identification, cause of death, time of death, soil analysis, location analysis, trace evidence, concealment patterns. And if the location of those remains connects to someone close to Nancy, or to property, vehicles, routes, or movements already under review, then the financial motive theory becomes even more serious. Because concealment is not just an act, it is a decision. Where remains are placed can say a lot. It can suggest panic, it can suggest planning, it can suggest familiarity with a location, it can suggest confidence, it can suggest a belief that the area would not be searched quickly. And if investigators can connect a concealment site to financial motive, opportunity, and digital movement, the case changes. But until there is official identification, the public has to be careful. Possible remains are not confirmed remains. Reports are not forensic conclusions. Suspicion is not proof. And no person should be declared guilty because a theory sounds convincing. That is the balance this case demands. The money theory may be serious, but it is still a theory until evidence supports it. And that evidence must be strong. If prosecutors ever tried to argue greed as a motive, they would likely need several things to line up. First, they would need proof that the financial pressure was real. That could come from debts, unpaid bills, foreclosure concerns, business problems, or urgent need for cash. Second, they would need proof that a request for money was actually made and refused. That could come from messages, witness statements, bank records, notes, or testimony. Third, they would need proof that the refusal happened close enough to Nancy's disappearance. to matter. Timing is everything. A disagreement months earlier may mean one thing. A major refusal shortly before the final dinner means something very different. Fourth, they would need opportunity. Who had access to Nancy? Who saw her last? Who knew her routine? Who could enter her world without alarming her? Fifth, they would need physical or digital evidence linking the theory to action. Phone movement, vehicle data, camera footage, DNA, blood evidence, trace evidence, statements, search history, location history, device activity. Without that final connection, motive remains incomplete. Because motive explains why someone might do something. Evidence shows whether they did. That is the key difference. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, the evidence may still be moving quietly behind the scenes. The source material describes several details that investigators may be studying closely. The reported loan refusal, the financial context, the final ride home, the long silence, the camera disruption, the pacemaker disconnect, the sealed emergency call, and a vehicle reportedly held for forensic review. That is why this case feels like it is standing at a crossroads. If the possible remains are not Nancy, the search continues and the case remains open in another way. But if the remains are identified as Nancy, everything shifts. The case may move from disappearance to possible homicide. The timeline becomes a death timeline. The final dinner becomes a more serious event. The ride home becomes a more important moment. The financial records become more central. The vehicle testing becomes more urgent. The 911 call becomes more powerful. The pacemaker data becomes a silent witness. And every person close to the final known hours comes under sharper scrutiny. That does not mean instant arrest. It means the case enters a more dangerous phase. Dangerous for the person responsible. Dangerous for any false story. Dangerous for anyone whose account does not match the science. Because science does not care about emotion. DNA does not care about family loyalty. Vehicle data does not care about excuses. Bank records do not care about sympathy. Pacemaker data does not care about theories. A timestamp does not care who sounds believable. It simply exists. And when enough timestamps line up, a story begins to form. That may be what investigators are waiting for now. Convergence. The moment when separate pieces of evidence begin telling the same story. Financial pressure, denied money, final contact, opportunity, device data, vehicle movement, forensic findings, behavior after the disappearance. If those pieces point in different directions, the case stays complicated. But if they begin pointing in the same direction, the investigation changes fast. That is why law enforcement may be so quiet. They may not want to reveal what is aligning. They may not want to alert the person they are watching. They may not want to explain the meaning of the pacemaker data. They may not want to reveal what the vehicle did or did not contain. They may not want to release the 911 call because it may contain a detail that only matters when compared with evidence the public has not seen. Silence can be frustrating, but silence can also mean precision. And precision is what this case needs. Because Nancy Guthrie's story should not be turned into reckless accusation. It should be handled like what it is, a serious investigation involving an elderly woman, possible family pressure, possible financial motive, and unconfirmed reports that could change the case forever. This is also where we have to remember the human side. Nancy was not just a name in a headline. She was a mother, a grandmother, a retired teacher, an elderly woman who should have been protected, not vulnerable. Whatever happened to her, the answer matters. It matters to her family. It matters to her community. It matters to everyone watching this case because cases involving older victims expose a painful truth. Sometimes danger does not come from far away. Sometimes it comes from access, from knowledge, from proximity, from someone who knows the routine, someone who knows the weaknesses, someone who knows what to say at the door, someone who knows when the lights go out. That is why investigators cannot ignore the people closest to the timeline. But they also cannot accuse without proof. That is the tension in this case. The facts are serious, the theories are disturbing, but the final answer must come from evidence. If the alleged loan refusal is true, it may become one of the most important emotional moments in the case. If financial pressure is documented, it may give motive structure. If the vehicle evidence connects, it may give movement structure. If the pacemaker data aligns, it may give biological timing. If the 911 call contains contradictions, it may give behavioral evidence. If remains are identified, it may give the investigation a final physical anchor. And if all of those pieces begin to connect, then what once looked like a disappearance may become a case built around motive, opportunity, and concealment. But for now, the public must wait. Wait for official identification. Wait for forensic confirmation. Wait for law enforcement to say what they can prove. Wait for the evidence to move from theory to fact. That waiting is painful. But it is necessary because in the end, justice is not about the fastest theory. It is about the strongest proof. If you have credible information related to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact law enforcement immediately. You can call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. You can also submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. If an official reward is being offered in connection with the case, credible information that helps investigators may qualify under the terms set by law enforcement or the family. Always confirm reward details through official sources before sharing or relying on reward claims. This video is created for documentary, educational, and informational purposes only. It is based on publicly discussed reports, source material, and narrative analysis. Nothing in this video is intended to accuse, defame, or declare guilt against any individual. All persons discussed are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. This is where Part 2 should leave the audience. Nancy Guthrie's case may no longer be only about where she went. It may be about what pressure surrounded her before she vanished. A reported loan request, a reported refusal, a valuable home, a final dinner, a private ride home, a silent overnight gap, a camera disruption, a pacemaker disconnect, a sealed 911 call, a vehicle under forensic review, and possible remains that, if confirmed, could change everything. Greed remains only a theory, but if investigators can connect money, timing, movement, and forensic evidence, that theory could become something much stronger. And in a case like this, the truth may not arrive with one loud announcement. It may arrive quietly, through records, through science, through a timestamp, through a vehicle, through DNA, through one detail that finally proves what really happened to Nancy Guthrie. There are moments in a missing person case when one sentence changes the way people look at everything. Not because it proves guilt, not because it confirms an arrest, not because it gives the family the answer they have been praying for, but because it shifts the focus. It turns the public's attention away from one version of the story and toward another possibility that feels far more personal, far more painful, and far more disturbing. That is what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case, when reports began circulating that investigators may now be looking closely at someone connected to her own family circle, a son-in-law. Those words are heavy. They must be handled carefully, because there is a major difference between being looked at, being named in a report, being considered a possible focus, and being proven guilty in court. No one should confuse those things. A source report is not a conviction. A theory is not evidence by itself. And a person being discussed in connection with an investigation does not mean that person committed a crime. But even with all of that caution, the report landed with force. Because for days and weeks, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had been surrounded by questions that seemed to point outward. A possible intruder, blood near the front door, cameras that were reportedly damaged or missing, questions about forced entry, a back door allegedly left wide open, a missing elderly woman who reportedly could not move far on her own. And then suddenly, the discussion shifted. What if the person investigators were looking at was not a random stranger? What if the answer was not somewhere far outside Nancy's world? What if the person who knew the house, the routines, the vulnerabilities, and the family dynamics was much closer than people first imagined? That is the possibility that changed the emotional temperature of the case. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was not someone who could easily vanish without help. She was elderly, vulnerable, and according to reports, physically limited in how far she could move on her own. That detail matters because it changes the way investigators have to look at every part of the night she disappeared. If Nancy could not walk far by herself, then the idea of her simply leaving the home and disappearing into the night becomes harder to accept. If she left, someone may have helped her. If she was taken, someone may have moved her. If she was injured, someone may have had to carry her, guide her, or place her into a vehicle. And that means the case is not only about who entered the house. It is about who had the ability, the access, and possibly the confidence to move Nancy without being stopped. In the beginning, many people focused on the idea of forced entry. That seemed to suggest an outsider, someone who came to the home without permission, someone who broke in, someone Nancy may not have known. But forced entry does not always tell a simple story. Sometimes it is real. Sometimes it is staged. Sometimes it happens after the main event. Sometimes it is misunderstood in the first hours of an investigation. And sometimes one part of a house tells one story while another part tells something completely different. That is why the physical layout of Nancy's home matters so much. The front door, the back door, the cameras, the blood, the driveway, the path, the gravel. Every part of that scene becomes important because the house may be holding the answers that people have been trying to find elsewhere. According to the discussion surrounding the case, there were blood drops near the front door area. That detail alone creates a disturbing image. An elderly woman's home, a front entrance, blood on the tiles, and then a question that does not easily go away. What happened there? Was there a confrontation at the door? Did Nancy come downstairs after someone rang or knocked? Was she injured near the entrance? Did she open the door to someone she recognized? Did someone damage the camera before approaching? Or was the front door only one part of a much larger movement through the house? The blood near the front entrance matters because blood suggests contact, injury, struggle, or at least a moment investigators cannot ignore. But the next problem is what reportedly was not seen. The blood trail did not clearly continue all the way toward the driveway. That raises another question. If Nancy was injured near the front door and then taken out toward a car, why did the visible blood not continue along the path? Could the gravel have made it harder to see? Possibly. Could the trail have been small, interrupted, or missed an early observation? Possibly. Could Nancy have been moved in a way that left less trace? Possibly. But investigators do not stop at possibilities. They ask what the scene supports. And if the front door blood does not create a clean path to the driveway, then the movement becomes harder to understand. That is where the reported back door detail becomes important. A source reportedly claimed the back door was wide open. That single detail changes the way the home must be imagined. Now, the story is not only about the front entrance. Now, investigators have to consider whether someone entered or exited through the back. Maybe the front was where contact happened. Maybe the back was where movement happened. Maybe the front was used to create a distraction. Maybe the back was the true route. Maybe the open door was accidental. Maybe it was part of staging. Or maybe it simply shows the case is more complicated than the first public details suggested. The house begins to feel less like a single scene and more like a puzzle. Blood at the front, an open back door, cameras reportedly smashed or missing, a victim who could not easily move without assistance, and no clear public explanation for how Nancy left the property. Those facts do not prove who did it, but they create a very specific kind of question. Was the person responsible familiar with the house? Because a stranger can still break into a home. A stranger can still see a doorbell camera. A stranger can still create violence. But if multiple cameras were targeted, if movement through the property was controlled, if the exit route avoided obvious visibility, then investigators would naturally ask whether the person had been there before. Who knew where the cameras were? Who knew which doors could be used? Who knew how Nancy moved inside the house? Who knew whether she came downstairs at night? Who knew whether she could hear someone at the door? Who knew whether she lived alone? Who knew whether she had a monitored alarm? Who knew the quiet areas of the property? These are not accusations. They are investigative questions. And in cases like this, questions about access often lead investigators toward people close to the victim first. That is normal. When someone disappears, police usually start with the inner circle: family, close friends, caregivers, neighbors, people who visited the house, people who knew the routine, people who had keys, codes, trust, or reason to be there. That does not mean the family is guilty. It means the family is closest to the facts. They know what is normal. They know what is unusual. They know who had conflict. They know who needed money. They know who had access. They know who saw Nancy last. That is why investigators begin there and then move outward. But the report that a son-in-law may be a prime focus of the investigation is different from simply saying police are doing routine interviews. The wording is what made people pause. May be the prime suspect. That phrase is serious. It is not the same as being charged. It is not the same as being named officially by police. It is not the same as guilt. But it suggests that investigators may have moved beyond basic questioning and into a sharper focus. That is why the report matters. It changes how people interpret the other details. The smashed cameras become more meaningful. The open back door becomes more suspicious. The blood at the front entrance becomes more concerning. The family vehicle reportedly taken into evidence becomes more important. And the idea of a random intruder begins to feel less simple. Because one of the biggest questions in this case has always been motive. Why would anyone take Nancy Guthrie? A random burglar usually wants to steal and leave. If a burglar enters a home and encounters an elderly woman, the most likely instinct is to run, not to take her. Taking her creates a problem. It creates weight, it creates risk, it creates movement. It creates the need for a vehicle, a destination, and a way to avoid being seen. An 84-year-old woman who cannot move quickly is not easy to abduct. That is why the random burglar theory feels difficult for many people following the case. Not impossible, but difficult. Because if someone took Nancy, there had to be a reason strong enough to justify the risk. Ransom, revenge, a personal motive, a financial motive, a cover-up, a staged scene, an attempt to hide something that happened inside the home. Those are the types of questions investigators would have to examine. And if the possible focus is someone close to the family, then motive becomes even more important. What did that person know? What did they need? What did they fear? What could Nancy have known? Was there conflict? Was there financial pressure? Was there a private disagreement? Was there something investigators found that made them turn inward? This is where the case becomes painful, because families in missing person cases are already suffering. They are afraid. They are grieving. They are waiting. They are under public attention. And then investigators still have to ask hard questions. They have to look at everyone. They have to test every statement. They have to follow evidence even when it leads into uncomfortable places. That is the hard truth of investigations. Compassion matters, but evidence matters too. And evidence does not avoid the family circle just because the truth may be painful. That is why the vehicle detail became one of the most serious parts of the report. According to the discussion, a family vehicle connected to Annie Guthrie's household was reportedly towed, impounded, and taken into evidence. That is not a small detail. Police do not usually tow and impound a vehicle connected to a missing person investigation unless they believe the vehicle may matter. That does not mean they already found evidence inside. It does not mean the owner is guilty. It does not mean anyone should jump to conclusions. Sometimes investigators take a vehicle because they need to rule it out. Sometimes they take it to preserve it before it can be cleaned, moved, altered, or contaminated. Sometimes they take it because a witness, camera, phone record, or timeline suggests it may have been used. But whatever the reason, when a vehicle is taken into evidence, the investigation has moved from questions into physical testing. And physical testing can change everything. A vehicle can hold evidence long after a person thinks the moment is gone. A car can trap fibers, hair, blood traces, soil, skin cells, plant material, touch DNA, residue from clothing, marks on seats, stains under mats, evidence in trunk seams. Tiny fragments in places nobody thinks to clean. If Nancy was transported, investigators would want to know how. If she was placed in a vehicle, investigators would want to know which one. If a car was used near her home that night, investigators would want to test it. If someone gave a timeline, investigators would compare that timeline to vehicle data. Where was the car? Who had access to it? Was it driven during the critical window? Was it cleaned afterward? Did the mileage change? Did cameras capture it? Did phones connected to the people in that household move in the same direction? Did any trace inside the vehicle connect to Nancy or her home? These are the kinds of questions that turn a car into a silent witness. A vehicle can confirm a story. It can contradict a story. It can eliminate a theory. Or it can become the bridge between the house and what happened next. That is why the seized vehicle report feels so important. Because Nancy's disappearance requires movement. If she did not walk away by herself, then someone moved her. And if someone moved her, a vehicle may hold the evidence. The car may not tell the whole story, but it may tell investigators enough to know whether someone's version of the night is true. That is where the case begins to narrow. Public speculation can go in many directions, but evidence narrows, a camera narrows, a blood pattern narrows, a door position narrows, a vehicle search narrows, a phone record narrows, a forensic result narrows. And if investigators are truly looking closely at a son-in-law, then they are not doing that based on one rumor alone. They would need something more, a statement that did not fit, a timeline issue, a vehicle connection, a forensic lead, a digital record, a physical detail inside or outside the home. Something must have made that focus meaningful enough for a source to describe it in such strong language. Again, the public does not know what that is. And until law enforcement confirms details, no one should pretend they do. But the pattern is serious. The cameras, the doors, the blood, the car, the possible family focus, the ransom confusion. Together, they create a case that feels less random than it may have seemed at first. That does not mean the answer is simple. It means the investigation may be moving inward and outward at the same time. Inward toward people who knew Nancy, outward toward vehicles, camera footage, devices, and possible ransom communications. That is why this case is so difficult to follow. Every detail opens another door. If the cameras were smashed, who smashed them? If the back door was open, who used it? If the blood was at the front, what happened there? If there was no clear trail, how was Nancy moved? If a vehicle was seized, what were investigators looking for? If ransom notes existed, were they real or fake? If the person responsible was close to Nancy, was the scene made to look like an outside abduction? And if the person responsible was not close to Nancy, how did they know enough to move through the scene?